The paint sat like a silent judgment on the cracked concrete of my porch. It was a 5-gallon bucket of stark, unforgiving white, the kind of white that promised to cover up years of neglect but also highlight every single flaw in the surface beneath it. My life felt a lot like that fence it was meant for, long, weathered, and in desperate need of a fresh start that I wasn't entirely sure it deserved. For 3 months, I had been living in this tiny rental cottage, a forgotten afterthought on the sprawling estate of the Croft Vineyard. My routine was a carefully constructed fortress against chaos. Wake at dawn, run the perimeter of the property where the wild grasses met the cultivated vines, work my remote data entry job until my eyes burned, and then sit on this porch, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills, feeling the ache of a loneliness so profound it had its own specific weight. I had a single keepsake from the life I'd left behind in the city. It was a small, smooth river stone tucked away in my sock drawer. My ex, Daniel, had given it to me on our first anniversary, a symbol of his supposed steadfastness. When he'd left, taking with him the shared apartment and my sense of stability, I'd almost thrown the stone into the river. But I couldn't. It wasn't a reminder of him anymore. It was a reminder of my own foolish capacity for trust, a lesson I carried with me like a quiet, internal scar. Here, in this borrowed solitude, I had just enough money to pay the rent and buy groceries. There was no room for error, no space for another misjudgment. Mr. Julian Croft was the owner of it all. The vineyard, the grand house on the hill that I could just see the slate roof of, and this little cottage he rented out for a price that was, I suspected, far below the market rate. I saw him most mornings, a distant figure walking the rows of his vines. He moved with a kind of settled purpose, a man rooted to his land. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and a quiet stillness that felt more like strength than aloofness. We had spoken exactly twice. Once when I signed the lease, his handshake firm and his gaze direct, and once when my car battery died and he appeared out of nowhere with jumper cables, refusing my offer of payment with a simple, "We're neighbors," that was a month ago. And now, this paint. The fence that separated his pristine vineyard from the dusty county road was over a mile long, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It was an eyesore, the one blemish on an otherwise perfect landscape. I'd mentioned it in passing to his groundskeeper, a friendly man named Hector, saying that if they ever needed a hand, I was good with a brush. I needed the money, plain and simple. I hadn't expected Hector to mention it to Mr. Croft. I certainly hadn't expected Mr. Croft to appear on my doorstep the next evening, the setting sun catching the silver in his hair. He didn't knock loudly, just a soft, deliberate rap of knuckles against the wood. When I opened the door, he was standing there, not smiling, but with a look of calm appraisal in his eyes. They were a deep, clear gray, the color of a stormy sea. "Leo," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the evening air. "Hector mentioned you were looking for some extra work. I was wondering if you'd be interested in painting the roadside fence. I can provide the supplies, of course. We can agree on a fair price for your labor." The offer hung in the air between us, a lifeline I hadn't dared to ask for. It was a straightforward business transaction, yet it felt like something more. The way he stood there, his posture relaxed but his attention focused entirely on me, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in a very long time. It was unnerving. "Yes," I heard myself say, the word coming out a little too quickly. "Yes, I'd be very interested." "Thank you, Mr. Croft." He gave a slight nod, a subtle shift of his head that conveyed both agreement and dismissal of my thanks. "The work is its own thanks," he said. "The supplies will be delivered to your porch tomorrow morning. We can settle on a price then." He looked past me for a moment, into the spare, clean space of my cottage. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness, aware of the worn armchair and the second-hand table. His gaze was not judgmental, merely observant. When his eyes returned to mine, a faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred at their corners. "The fence is long," he added. "Pace yourself." And then he was gone, walking back up the gravel path toward the main house, his stride even and unhurried. I stood in the doorway, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms, and watched him go. It was a simple offer of work, a contract, a way to earn some much-needed cash. But as I closed the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that a quiet foundation was settling into place, that a door I had long considered locked was being gently, patiently tested. The weight of his gaze lingered long after he had disappeared from view, a steady pressure that was both unsettling and, to my own surprise, deeply calming. The next morning, the paint was there, along with brushes, scrapers, and a brand new power washer still in its box. Beside it all was a sealed envelope. Inside, a check was made out to me for an amount that was far too generous for a simple advance. A handwritten note, in a strong, clean script, was clipped to it. It read, for the first half of the work, "Let me know if the equipment is satisfactory. J. C." I stared at the initials, at the confidence in the ink. Julian Croft. J. C. He had created a space for me, an opportunity, and had done so with a quiet respect that asked for nothing in return except a job well done. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach loosen, just a fraction. The work began. The first few days were a blur of scraping and pressure washing. The old paint came off in satisfying sheets, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. It was hard, physical labor under the hot sun, and I welcomed it. It tired my body and quieted my mind. The constant hum of the power washer created a bubble of sound, insulating me from my own thoughts. From my position along the road, I had a clear view of the vineyard's daily rhythm. I saw the workers moving through the vines, their chatter a distant, pleasant murmur. I saw Hector on his utility vehicle, giving me a thumbs up as he passed. And I saw Mr. Croft. He was a constant, steady presence. He didn't hover or inspect my work. He simply existed within his domain. I'd see him in the mornings, consulting with his vineyard manager, his posture attentive, his hands gesturing to a particular row of grapes. In the afternoons, he would sometimes walk the dirt track that ran parallel to the fence, his two golden retrievers trotting happily at his heels. He would raise a hand in greeting, a simple acknowledgement of my existence, and I would raise my scraper in return. His gaze would sweep over my progress, a quick, efficient assessment, and then he would continue on his way. I found myself watching for him. I started to learn the subtle language of his movements. A slight tension in his shoulders meant a problem with the irrigation. A slow, thoughtful pace with his head down meant he was tasting the grapes, checking their sugar levels. I began to notice the small details, the way the sun lit the silver in his hair, the faded softness of his denim work shirts, the laugh lines around his eyes that were only visible when he smiled at his dogs. He was a man comfortable in his own skin, at home in his world. And I was an outsider, painting the border of it. One afternoon, the heat was particularly oppressive. The sun beat down, and the air was thick and still. I was drenched in sweat, my muscles aching from hours of holding the heavy sprayer. I saw him coming down the track, not with his dogs this time, but carrying a small tray. As he got closer, I saw it held a tall pitcher beaded with condensation and 2 glasses. He stopped a few feet away, setting the tray down on a flat-topped fence post. "You look like you could use this," he said. His voice was calm, cutting through the haze of my exhaustion. "Lemonade." I shut off the power washer, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. I wiped my brow with the back of a gritty hand. "Mr. Croft, you don't have to do that, I know," he said simply. He poured the lemonade into the 2 glasses. It was pale yellow and filled with ice that clinked musically. He held one out to me. "But I want to. Take a break with me." The invitation was gentle, an offer, not a command. I hesitated for only a second before taking the glass. Our fingers brushed as I did, and the contact was like a small electric shock against my overheated skin. His hands were what I noticed first. They were large and capable, with clean, short nails and a network of faint lines etched into the skin. They were the hands of a man who worked, who built things, who tended to the earth. They were not the soft hands of a wealthy man who simply owned things. The thought was unexpected, and it lodged itself in my mind. I took a long drink of the lemonade. It was tart and sweet and incredibly cold, a shock of relief to my system. He leaned against the fence beside me, sipping his own drink, his gaze fixed on the horizon. We stood in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the buzzing of insects in the tall grass and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. "You're doing good work, Leo," he said finally, his eyes still on the hills. "Thorough. I believe in doing a job right," I replied, my voice a little rough from disuse. He turned his head to look at me then, and the full force of his steady, gray-eyed gaze was unnerving. It felt like he was seeing past the sweat and the grime, past the careful walls I had built around myself. "I can see that," he said. A small, almost smile touched his lips. It's a rare quality, the weight of that gaze, the quiet sincerity in his voice, made my chest feel tight. I looked away, down at the half-prepped fence, at the line between the old and the new. It was just a compliment. A boss complimenting his worker. But it felt like more. It felt like he was acknowledging something in me, some core principle of my character that I clung to like a piece of driftwood in a storm. He was seeing the man, not just the laborer. He finished his lemonade and placed the empty glass back on the tray. "Don't work too long in this heat," he said. "The fence will be there tomorrow." He picked up the tray and started back toward the house. I watched him walk away, the simple act of him bringing me a cold drink on a hot day feeling monumental. It was an act of kindness, of care. And in my small, solitary world, care was a foreign currency. I stood there for a long time after he was gone, the cold glass still in my hand, the taste of lemonade on my lips, and I felt a strange and unfamiliar warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was the warmth of being seen. The next day, I began to paint. The pure, clean white went on smoothly over the prepared wood. The transformation was immediate and deeply satisfying. With every stroke of the brush, I was erasing the neglect, creating a crisp, clean line against the green of the vineyard and the blue of the sky. The work was meditative. It allowed my mind to wander while my hands were busy, and my mind, more often than not, wandered to Julian Croft. I replayed our short conversation over and over. The way he'd said, "Take a break with me," the brush of our fingers. The warmth in his eyes when he'd called my work thorough. I analyzed each word, each gesture, searching for a hidden meaning, then chiding myself for doing so. He was just being a decent employer, a kind man. To read anything more into it was to invite the kind of disappointment I had sworn to avoid. Daniel had been full of grand gestures and poetic words. Julian Croft's kindness was of a different sort. It was quiet, practical, and grounded. It was a glass of lemonade, not a bouquet of roses. And for some reason, that felt more real, more trustworthy. I started to notice how he protected things. Not just his vines, but everything in his care. I saw him gently redirect one of his dogs when it started to chase a rabbit, his voice low and soothing. I saw him stop to pick up a fallen branch from the path, clearing the way for others. One afternoon, a car full of tourists pulled over, and a woman tried to climb the fence to take a picture in the vineyard. Mr. Croft approached them, not with anger, but with a calm authority. He explained politely that it was private property and that the vines were delicate. He spoke to them with respect, but his message was firm. He was a guardian of his space, a protector. The thought sent a strange shiver through me. What would it feel like to be protected by a man like that? The feeling was dangerous. It was a yearning I had tried to bury deep inside myself. I was here to work, to earn money, to rebuild my life on my own terms. I was not here to develop a foolish, impossible crush on my wealthy, older landlord. I tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on the rhythmic sweep of the brush, the smell of the paint, the heat of the sun on my back. But his presence was a soft gravity I couldn't escape. A week into the painting, a delivery truck arrived at the main house. Later that day, I saw Mr. Croft and Hector struggling to move a large, flat-packed box from the truck bed into a workshop near the house. It was clearly heavy and awkward. I watched for a few minutes, my brush hovering over the fence. They were managing, but barely. On impulse, I set my brush down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked up the path toward them. "Need a hand?" I asked, feeling a little bold. Mr. Croft looked up, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked surprised to see me, but not displeased. "Leo, I wouldn't want to take you away from your work. A break is probably a good idea," I said, echoing his own words from the week before. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps recognition, passed through his eyes. "We'd appreciate it," he said with a nod. "It's a new workbench. Heavier than it looked in the catalog. With 3 of us, the box was manageable." We carried it into the workshop, a large, airy space that smelled of sawdust and oil. It was impeccably organized. Tools hung in neat rows on a pegboard. Jars of screws and nails were meticulously labeled, and the floor was swept clean. It was the space of a man who found peace in order and creation. We set the box down, and Hector, wiping his brow, thanked me profusely before heading off to another task. I was left alone in the workshop with Mr. Croft. The sudden intimacy of the enclosed space felt charged. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with the honest smell of his exertion. "Thank you, Leo," he said, leaning back against the old workbench we were there to replace. "I owe you one." "Not at all," I said, feeling my cheeks flush. "Happy to help." I looked around the workshop, genuinely impressed. "This is an amazing space. It's my escape," he admitted, his voice a little softer than usual. "When the business side of the vineyard gets to be too much, I come in here and build things. Simple things. Birdhouses, bookshelves. Things with clear instructions and a definite end." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "Do you work with your hands?" "Other than painting." The question was unexpected. It was personal. "I used to," I said, the words feeling rusty. "I like to sketch. Mostly charcoal. But I haven't had much space for it lately." The admission felt like a vulnerability, a crack in my carefully constructed armor. He listened, his expression unreadable but attentive. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Space is important," he said, his gaze thoughtful. "Both physical and mental." He pushed himself off the workbench. "Well, I shouldn't keep you. Thank you again for the help." As I walked back to my fence, the brief exchange replayed in my mind. He had asked about me. He had listened. He had shared a small piece of himself, his retreat, his need for simple, definable tasks. It was another brick in the foundation that was quietly, inexorably being built between us. A shared moment of physical effort, a brief, honest conversation. It was nothing, and it was everything. The white paint on the fence seemed to shine a little brighter, the line I was creating sharper and more defined. I felt a flicker of hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, begin to take root in the solitary soil of my heart. The days settled into a new rhythm. My work on the fence continued, a steady progression of white that marked the passing of time. Mr. Croft's presence became a familiar part of my landscape. Sometimes he would bring me coffee in the morning if it was chilly, or a cold bottle of water in the afternoon. He never stayed long, just a few minutes of quiet conversation. He asked about the town I grew up in, about the books I liked to read. He told me about the history of the vineyard, how his grandfather had planted the first vines. Our conversations were like sketches, slowly revealing the shape and texture of each other's lives. I learned that his full name was Julian, but he never corrected me when I called him Mr. Croft. It felt like a boundary he was allowing me to maintain, a sign of respect for our initial arrangement. I learned that his wife had passed away over a decade ago, and that his children were grown and lived on the other side of the country. He spoke of them with a mixture of pride and a quiet, aching distance. I sensed in him a loneliness that mirrored my own, though his was born of loss and time, and mine of betrayal and retreat. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind picked up, whipping through the vines and rattling the leaves. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the dusty ground with audible plops. I quickly packed up my paint and brushes, trying to secure the lids before the downpour began. "Leo," I heard Julian's voice call out, sharp and commanding over the rising wind. He was jogging down the path from the house, shrugging on a rain jacket. "Leave that. Get inside the workshop, quickly." There was no time to argue. The heavens opened, and the rain came down in a torrential sheet. I abandoned my supplies and ran, following him into the dry, sawdust-scented shelter of the workshop. He pulled the large sliding door shut, and the roar of the storm was instantly muted to a drumming on the roof. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, water dripping from our hair and clothes onto the clean concrete floor. "That came out of nowhere," I said, shaking the water from my hands. "It does that sometimes, in the valley," he said. He grabbed a couple of clean rags from a hook and handed one to me. "Here." I took it, our fingers brushing again. This time, the touch lingered for a fraction of a second longer. A deliberate, quiet connection. I looked up and met his gaze. In the dim light of the workshop, with the storm raging outside, the space felt incredibly intimate. I could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the fine lines etched by time and sun. The air was thick with the smell of rain and damp earth and something else, something that was just him. "I hope your supplies will be all right," he said, his voice low. "They'll be fine," I assured him, though I hadn't given them a second thought. My mind was entirely focused on him, on the simple fact of us being here, together, shut away from the world. He moved over to the new workbench we had assembled the week before and ran a hand over its smooth, clear-coated surface. "I finished it," he said, a note of quiet satisfaction in his tone. "Thank you again for your help with it. It looks great," I said, and I meant it. It was solid, perfectly joined, a testament to his careful work. "You're good with your hands." The words were out before I could stop them, and I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. It felt too personal, too forward. But Julian didn't seem to mind. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "They've served me well," he said thoughtfully. He looked back at me, his expression serious. "Leo, I hope my bringing you refreshments or asking for your help doesn't feel obligatory. I want to be clear. The job you're doing is a transaction. Our interactions outside of that, they are not. I enjoy your company." His honesty was like a punch to the gut, in the best possible way. He was naming the unspoken tension, addressing the power imbalance head-on. He was giving me an out, assuring me that my job was not contingent on my friendliness. He was, in his own steady, quiet way, showing an incredible amount of respect for my autonomy. "I enjoy yours too, Julian," I said, the name feeling natural on my tongue for the first time. A slow smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes and making them shine. The simple act of me using his first name seemed to please him more than I could have anticipated. The storm outside continued to beat against the roof, but inside the workshop, a different kind of quiet had settled. It was the quiet of understanding, of a boundary acknowledged and a new space being opened between two people. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "You mentioned you sketch," he said, picking up our previous conversation as if no time had passed. "Charcoal," I nodded, feeling that old vulnerability stir again. "I haven't in a long time." It felt indulgent, I guess. When things are tight, you focus on what's necessary. "Art is necessary," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "It's not an indulgence. It's how we make sense of the world. It's how we find the beauty in it." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "My late wife, Eleanor, was a painter. This whole wall," he gestured to the far wall of the workshop, "used to be her easel space. The light is good in the afternoons." The admission was a gift. He was sharing a piece of his past, a piece of his heart, with me. I imagined a woman here, in this space, creating art, filling the room with color and life. I felt a pang of something, not jealousy, but a deep, resonant sadness for his loss, and a profound gratitude that he felt comfortable enough to share it with me. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He gave a small, sad smile. "It was a long time ago, but the good memories remain. She would have liked you," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "She appreciated people who were thorough." The rain began to soften, its rhythm slowing from a frantic drumming to a gentle patter. The light outside shifted, the dark gray brightening to a soft silver. The storm was passing. The moment of enforced intimacy was coming to an end. Neither of us moved. I felt suspended in time, caught in the quiet aftermath of the storm and his revelation. I had come in here to escape the rain, but it felt like I had found shelter for a part of myself I had long left out in the cold. Finally, he pushed himself off the workbench. "It sounds like it's letting up," he said. "Let's check on your paint." We slid the door open, and the world smelled clean and new, washed by the rain. A rainbow was beginning to form over the vineyard, a perfect, vibrant arc against the clearing sky. My paint cans were waterlogged, but sealed. Everything was fine. As I began to gather my things, Julian spoke again. "Leo," he said, and I turned. He was standing in the doorway of the workshop, framed by the light. "When you're finished with the fence, I have another project, if you're interested. The guest cottage needs some work. Painting, repairs. But it also has a small sunroom. The light is good in the afternoons." The offer was clear. It was a job, yes, but it was also something more. It was an offer of space. The space I had told him I lacked. He was not just offering me work. He was offering me a place to be myself, to reclaim a part of my life I had set aside. It was the most thoughtful, most profound gesture anyone had made for me in years. "I'd like that very much, Julian," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. He simply nodded, the quiet smile returning to his face. And as I went back to my work, The last rays of the afternoon sun breaking through the clouds, I knew that something had irrevocably shifted. The fence I was painting no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a beginning. The final stretch of the fence took another week. A comfortable pattern emerged from our storm-enforced closeness. Julian would find a reason to be near my work area around mid-afternoon. Sometimes he'd bring out a book and sit on a bench in the shade, reading. He never interrupted me, but his presence was a quiet anchor to my day. The weight of his nearness was a constant, pleasant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I found myself painting with more care, my strokes more deliberate, as if the fence itself were a message I was trying to send him. A message of competence, of reliability, of worth. One afternoon, a sleek, expensive car I didn't recognize pulled up alongside the road. A man in a sharp suit got out, his face a mask of urban impatience. He strode over to where Julian was sitting. I was too far away to hear their words, but the man's body language was aggressive, his gestures sharp and dismissive. Julian remained calm, his posture unchanged, listening. After a few minutes, the suited man's gaze swept over the vineyard and then landed on me. He gestured in my direction with a flick of his wrist, a clear look of disdain on his face. A hot, familiar shame washed over me. I knew that look. It was the look of someone who saw only a laborer, a hired hand, someone insignificant. I felt myself shrink, my shoulders hunching as I turned my back to them. Focusing fiercely on the section of fence in front of me, my brushstrokes suddenly clumsy. I heard Julian's voice, the tone still low but carrying a new edge of steel. I couldn't make out the words, but the effect was immediate. The other man took a half step back, his aggressive posture deflating. A few more curt words were exchanged, and then the man stalked back to his car, slamming the door before speeding away, kicking up a cloud of dust. I kept my back turned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt exposed, judged. I waited for Julian to leave, to retreat to the privacy of his house, to put distance between himself and the unpleasantness. Instead, I heard the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel behind me. He stopped a few feet away. "Leo," he said. His voice was gentle. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just kept painting, my hand unsteady. "It's fine," I mumbled, my voice tight. "No," he said, his voice closer now. "It's not. I want to apologize for his behavior." That was Richard Thorne, a potential business partner. Or rather, a former potential partner. The finality in his tone was unmistakable. I finally stopped painting and turned to face him. His expression was serious, his gray eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "It's not your fault he's a jerk. He disrespected someone on my land. Someone I respect," Julian said, his gaze locked on mine. "That makes it my business." The word hung in the air between us. Respect. He had chosen it carefully. He wasn't saying he was my protector in some possessive way. He was saying he was my ally. The distinction was critical. The silence stretched, filled with the things we weren't saying. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the vineyard. The air grew cooler. I felt a sudden, desperate need to break through the layers of subtext, to know what was real. "Julian," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you so good to me?" He took a step closer, closing the distance between us until we were only an arm's length apart. The scent of him, clean and earthy, enveloped me. His gaze was intense, searching. "I think you know why," he said, his voice low and rough. "But I think it's important that I say it. I am not a man who plays games, Leo. My life is too short for ambiguity." My breath caught in my throat. "This is it. The moment where everything changes. I enjoy your presence," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "I admire your resilience, your quiet strength. When I look at you, I don't see a hired hand. I see a man of character and substance. And I find myself wanting to be near that, wanting to know that man better." He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "I want to be clear," he said, echoing the words he'd used in the workshop, his mantra of consent and respect. "This changes nothing about our arrangement. The work is the work. Your independence is your own. But I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that my feelings for you have grown beyond those of a simple landlord or employer. If that makes you uncomfortable, you have only to say the word, and we will never speak of it again." His confession was the bravest, most terrifying, most wonderful thing I had ever heard. He had laid his feelings bare, but he had done so, while simultaneously building a fortress around my own autonomy. He was giving me all the power. He was offering his heart and asking for nothing in return except my honest answer. The fear of rejection that had been my constant companion for so long was suddenly eclipsed by a much larger, more terrifying fear. The fear of letting this incredible, honest man walk away. I took a deep breath, the scent of the drying paint and the evening air filling my lungs. "It doesn't make me uncomfortable," I said, my voice shaking slightly but clear. I took a small step forward, closing the last bit of space between us. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Julian." I couldn't find the words. So instead, I reached out. My hand, smudged with white paint, came up and rested on his chest, right over his heart. I could feel its steady, solid beat beneath my palm. It was the most honest thing in the world. I looked up into his eyes, hoping he could see everything I couldn't say. A look of profound relief washed over his face. His own hand came up and covered mine, his fingers lacing with my own. His touch was warm and firm, a silent confirmation. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He simply stood there, holding my hand against his chest, letting me lead. Slowly, I leaned in. He met me halfway. His other hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my skin. His touch was hesitant, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of arrival. It was soft and slow and deeply sure of itself. His lips were warm and gentle against mine, a question and an answer in one. It tasted of honesty and patience and the faint, sweet trace of the lemonade he'd shared with me. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. My hand was still on his chest, our fingers intertwined. I could feel the thrum of his heartbeat, a little faster now, matching my own. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I opened my eyes, looking at the man who had so carefully and patiently dismantled all my defenses. "Julian," I whispered back. There was nothing else to say. The world had shifted on its axis, and we were at the quiet center of it. The fence was nearly finished, a stark white line against the darkening landscape. A boundary had been painted, but a far more important one had just been lovingly, carefully, and mutually dissolved. The following morning, I woke before the dawn, the memory of the kiss a warm, living thing inside me. A part of me, the old, cautious part, was braced for the awkwardness, the morning after retreat. I half expected to find an envelope with my final payment on the porch and a polite, distant note. It was the pattern I knew, the script I had learned to expect. But when I opened my door to the cool, gray light, Julian was there. He wasn't on my porch, but he was walking down the path from the main house, his two golden retrievers trotting beside him. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, and he carried 2 mugs. He saw me and his face broke into a slow, genuine smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and it sent a wave of relief through me so powerful it almost buckled my knees. "I was hoping I'd catch you," he said as he approached. "I brought coffee." He handed me one of the mugs. It was heavy and warm, and the steam rising from it carried the rich, dark scent of a fresh brew. I took a sip. It was perfect. "Thank you," I said, my voice still a little rough with sleep. "Of course," he said. We stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sky begin to lighten in the east. The dogs sat patiently at his feet, their tails thumping a soft rhythm against the gravel. "Julian," I started, needing to address the elephant in the room. "About last night." He turned to me, his expression open and serious. "I have no regrets, Leo. My only concern is for you. I need to know that you feel the same, and that you feel safe, respected." There it was again. His unwavering commitment to my well-being, to ensuring there was no hint of coercion or obligation. He was actively working to dismantle the power imbalance between us, brick by brick. "I do," I said, and the truth of it resonated in my bones. I felt seen and very respected. I looked down into my coffee mug, then back up at him. "My only concern is, well, it's the optics, I guess. Me, living here, working for you. People like that man yesterday. They'll talk. They'll assume things." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. I have never cared much for the opinions of men like Richard Thorne, he said calmly. But I understand your concern. It's valid. Your reputation matters. And more importantly, your sense of self matters. He took a sip of his coffee. Which is why I want to propose a change to our arrangement. My heart sank a little. I thought he was going to suggest I move out, to create distance. The offer to work on the guest cottage still stands, he continued, seeming to read my mind. But I want to frame it differently. I'd like to hire you not just as a painter, but as a consultant, to help me design and furnish the space. Not just the sunroom, but the whole cottage. To turn it into a proper, functioning artist's retreat. I will pay you a fair consulting fee, separate from any physical labor you choose to do. It will be a formal contract. It establishes you as a professional, an equal partner in a project, not just the man who paints my fences. I was floored. He had taken my vague anxiety and transformed it into a practical, respectful solution. He was not only reassuring me with words, he was taking concrete actions to reinforce my independence and professional standing. He was building a new framework for our relationship, one based on mutual respect and collaboration. And, he added, a slight hesitation in his voice, the guest cottage has its own driveway, with access from the secondary road. You would have your own space, entirely separate from the main house. Your own key. You could come and go as you please, with no need to even pass my front door unless you wanted to. It would be your space to work in. And, if you chose, to live in. As my tenant, under a new lease. Or, as something else. The choice would be yours. Always, he had thought of everything. He had anticipated my fears of dependency, of being seen as a kept man, and had offered a solution that gave me more autonomy, not less. He was not trying to absorb me into his world. He was offering me a space to build my own, right alongside his. Tears pricked at the back of my eyes, and I blinked them away fiercely. Julian, I said, my voice thick. That's incredibly generous. It's not generous, he countered gently. It's practical, and it's what I want. I want you here, Leo, but I want you here as your own man. Whole and independent. That is the man I am drawn to. A few days later, after I had applied the final, perfect coat of white paint to the last section of the fence, we stood together, admiring my work. The fence stretched out in both directions, a crisp, brilliant line defining the edge of the vineyard. It looked clean, strong, and new. A project completed. It's perfect, Julian said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. He handed me a final check. For a job well done. I took it, but my mind was elsewhere. I'm ready to start on the guest cottage, I said. I've already been sketching some ideas for the sunroom, he smiled, that slow, warm smile that made my chest ache. I have the contract ready in the house. And the key. That afternoon, we signed the new agreement in his study, a beautiful room lined with books and smelling of old paper and lemon oil. It felt formal and right. He handed me a single, old-fashioned brass key. It felt heavy in my palm, a tangible symbol of the trust and space he was giving me. The next week was a test of this new dynamic. Julian had a series of business meetings, and a wine critic from a major magazine came to visit. The vineyard was buzzing with a different kind of energy. I saw Julian in his role as the master of the estate, confident and knowledgeable, a respected figure in his industry. He would see me working in the garden of the guest cottage, and he would introduce me to his associates simply and without fuss. This is Leo, he would say. He's an artist and designer who is helping me renovate the cottage. He never added my boyfriend or my partner. He just stated my professional role, letting my presence and my work speak for themselves. He gave me a nod of solidarity, a shared glance that said, we know what we are to each other. That is all that matters. And in doing so, he made me feel more included and respected than any grand declaration ever could have. He was protecting our nascent relationship by giving it the quiet, private space it needed to grow. The guest cottage became my sanctuary. It was a small, stone building set back from the main house, nestled in a grove of old oak trees. It had good bones, but had been neglected for years. I started by clearing the overgrown garden, then moved inside, stripping old wallpaper and sanding floors. The physical work was grounding, and the creative work of redesigning the space was invigorating. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that was entirely my own. And I started to sketch again. In the afternoons, when the light in the sunroom was just right, I would sit with my charcoal and a large pad of paper. I sketched the view from the window, the gnarled branches of the oak trees, the way the light filtered through the leaves. I sketched the tools in Julian's workshop. And one evening, as he sat reading in an armchair in the cottage's small living room, I sketched him. I captured the way he held his book, the thoughtful line of his brow, the quiet strength in his hands. He looked up and saw me watching him, my charcoal poised over the paper. He didn't move. He just smiled, a silent permission, and went back to his reading, allowing me to see him, to capture him, to make him a part of my art. We fell into a new rhythm, one that was uniquely ours. Our days were our own. I had my work at the cottage, and he had his work at the vineyard. But our evenings were for us. Sometimes he would cook for me in the main house's large, warm kitchen. Other times, I would make a simple meal for us at the cottage. We would eat and talk, sharing the details of our day. We learned each other's habits, the small things that make up a life. He learned that I liked my coffee black and that I couldn't sleep if a door was left ajar. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he was concentrating, and that he had a surprising fondness for old black and white movies. Our intimacy grew in these quiet, domestic moments. It wasn't just in the slow, tender kisses we shared on the cottage porch, or the way his hand would find mine as we walked through the vineyard at sunset. It was in the way he would leave a thermos of hot tea for me when I was working late, or the way I would make sure the book he was reading was on his nightstand. It was a language of small, steady acts of care. It was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual support and profound respect. One Saturday morning, I woke up in the guest cottage's newly painted bedroom. The sun was streaming through the windows, and the smell of coffee was wafting in from the small kitchen. I walked out to find Julian standing at the stove, humming his slightly off-key tune, flipping pancakes. He was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, and he looked completely at home. My home. Our home. He turned and smiled when he saw me. "Morning," he said. "I thought we could have breakfast on the porch." We sat outside, eating pancakes and watching the morning light move across the vineyard. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the sound of birdsong. It was a simple, perfect moment. There was no spectacle, no grand romance. It was just life. A quiet, shared life that we were building together, one day at a time. "I was thinking," Julian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "The sunroom is almost finished. Your drafting table looks perfect in there." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "I was also thinking that the rent on this cottage is ridiculously low. I think my tenant should probably start paying me in a different currency." I raised an eyebrow, a playful smile on my face. "Oh, and what currency would that be?" He reached across the small table and took my hand. His thumb gently stroked the back of my knuckles. "Sketches," he said, his voice soft. "An occasional painting for my study. Your presence at my dinner table. The sound of your work here in the afternoons. Your choice, of course." I looked at our joined hands, then up at his face. The love I felt for this man was a steady, warm thing, as reliable as the sun rising over his vines. He wasn't just my partner. He was my patron, my friend, my ally. He had seen me when I felt invisible, and he had offered me not a rescue, but a foundation on which I could rebuild myself. "I think," I said, my voice full of an emotion I no longer tried to hide, "that I can afford those terms." I squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. I looked out at the long white fence, gleaming in the morning sun. It was the line that had brought me here, the job that had led me to him. It was a boundary I had been hired to restore. But the man sitting across from me had taught me that the most important lines are not the ones that divide, but the ones you learn to cross, carefully and with intention, together. The difference in our ages, in our bank accounts, it had all become just context, like the color of the sky or the richness of the soil. The reality was the steady warmth of his hand in mine, the shared silence, the quiet, unshakable feeling that I was, finally, home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.